This is Focus on Your Health. It's brought to you by Kingman Regional Medical Center in historic Kingman, Arizona. I'm T.G. Lafredo, and this week I'm coming to you from KRMC's Office of Research and Sponsored Programs. My guests are Anthony Santarelli, Ph.D. He is the Director of Research and Sponsored Programs, and Diana Lalitsasivimol, Ph.D. She is the Manager of the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs, and she's the Co-Chair of the Institutional Review Board. Thank you so much for having me in today. I've been meaning to meet up with you, and I'm so interested in what you do and how you do it here. So we are going to talk in particular about clinical trials for cancer patients at KRMC. But I think in the first place, I just want to know a little bit about the research, that wing of the hospital. This is something fairly new to KRMC, true?
Absolutely true. The Office of Research and Sponsored Programs is a new initiative by the hospital that was started in the summer of 2022 to work to provide a common through line for all of the research projects, clinical trials, and grant programs that the hospital has available for patients to engage with.
So there are a number of state and federal funding opportunities that are available, and not everyone knows about them. And what we would like to do is offer a way for any managers, directors, anyone that has a really good project idea for improving community health and improving patient outcomes, improving healthcare in general, to have an avenue to make those projects come to life.
When we think about what this office kind of focuses on, it does have three major components. The first is research, where we index and work with medical data to do predictive analytics for upcoming trends and needs through three major realms. Those being largely epidemiological studies, so the rates of diseases, how common they are within the community, and how many we can predict in the upcoming years to appropriately staff the hospital for those. Health equity, are individuals who need to come to the hospital able to do so equitably across different sociocultural demographic factors. Medical education studies, interventional medicine studies, and of course, diagnostic medicine studies. The second major arm that we really focus on are the clinical trials, which I know we'll be talking more about today. And then finally, we do have the grants program, which is one of the common end goals for research and clinical trials. You've identified a gap in care, or you've identified a new therapy which may promote better recovery from an illness. How do you get that implemented from a single restricted population, like in a research study, to widespread population, like you would do for a service delivery from a hospital?
You're talking about a very broad range of tasks and subjects that you're working on. How many people are on the team here?
We currently have 3 people that officially work in our office. Yeah. So myself and Dr. Santarelli, and then we also have a third person, Dr. Lauren Peterson, who is our grants administrator.
How do you keep up with all that? It's just 3 people.
Well, to be honest...
A lot of Excel sheets.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
While we have 3 people to do a lot of the rote work in it, the idea generation comes with our individuals who are frontline with patients. They see a gap in the care, or they see the ineffective treatments, and they identify things which may work better, and then they work to propose that study. We'll sit down and we'll work with a physician like Dr. Rivera over at the Cancer Center, or Dr. John Assers with the COVID services, to refine that idea to the point where the data that they collect at the end of the day is enough to make a benefits determination. So the idea comes critically from our medical providers first. We work with them to refine that idea and then analyze that idea. The data collection actually comes from a huge workforce of students and resident physicians that we take on from a couple of different universities throughout Arizona and the Southwest.
Well, Dr. Santarelli, you mentioned Dr. Edgardo Rivera. He is the Director of Oncology Services here at KRMC. And shortly after Dr. Rivera started here at the hospital, I asked him how he planned to advance the oncology program. He said back then, this was 2016, that one of his priorities was to bring clinical trials to KRMC. Here's a little clip of what he had to say.
Just to be part of perhaps be able to provide something that can help us in the actual fight against cancer, that to me is significant, not only for us as physicians, but also for the hospital, to be able to say that, hey, we were able to participate on the clinical trial that drug X or drug Y eventually led to the approval of that specific drug. So to me, that's significant. And to be able to provide that to the patient, the opportunity to try a drug that otherwise would not be commercially available, to me, that's significant. So, and it really raises the level of expertise of the hospital to a different level.
Can we go into a little bit more depth about some of these advantages Dr. Rivera cited? So for one, how clinical trials are good for patients.
Yes, of course. So clinical trials are center around the patient. They're based on medical research that wants to improve patient care and patient outcomes. That is the major goal of clinical trials. And they're designed to answer the questions of, does a particular treatment work? Does it work better than the other treatments, the other standards of care? And does it have any side effects? Are we increasing progression-free survival and overall survival? So clinical trials are designed to answer these types of questions and basically improve the health and quality of care for patients. And until well-designed trials have been carried out, we don't have enough evidence to know if a treatment is both effective and safe. There is always that primary goal for phase 1 to phase 4 studies, no matter what stage it's at, where we don't know if a given treatment will work on a patient until it has been trialed in other patients. The ultimate goal is to provide benefit to both the patient and other patients in the future.
Dr. Lalitsasivimol, how does a patient qualify for clinical trials, or how do you identify a potential patient for them?
Accrual or going on a clinical trial is actually relatively low in the United States. It's only about 2% of cancer patients that end up going on a clinical trial. And one of the issues is a lack of awareness, whether it's from the provider side, because the provider doesn't know about it, or whether it's a lack of awareness from the patient side, because they don't know about it. So to address this, what I usually do is during the consult or the initial visit, I'll go in and just introduce myself as another resource that patients have, and I may or may not contact them in the future, just based on whether it's needed or not. Before a patient enrolls on a clinical trial, if Dr. Rivera, upon reviewing their medical record, sees that they could be an eligible patient for a specific trial, he will talk to them during their visit and say, hey, you could be eligible for this specific trial. Would you like to talk to a clinical trial coordinator? That's when I come in and I speak to them, and we go through what's called an informed consent process. I explain to them, you could qualify for this trial. If you would like me to review your record, I will go through the eligibility criteria and compare it against your medical record and see if you could be eligible for this trial or not. If you are, you could go on it. You are allowed to leave at any point. Every clinical trial is going to be voluntary. You can leave at any point, and it will not affect the medical care that you receive at the cancer center or at our facility in general. So it's a constant conversation between myself, the physician, and the patient.
If you're just joining us, this is Focus on Your Health. I'm TG Lafredo, and today I'm pretty sure I'm TG Lafredo. And my guests today are Diana Lalitsasivimol, PhD. She is the manager of the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs. She's also co-chair of the Institutional Review Board here at KRMC. And also Anthony Santarelli, PhD. He is the director of the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs. My understanding is that clinical trials are open for a relatively short amount of time, right? Like there's a sort of a shorter window in terms of we're trying this medicine or this modality for the next 6 months.
So it depends on the clinical trial itself.
Okay.
So for what the classic clinical trials that we think of as a treatment trial, those are often open for years.
Oh, okay.
So you could have a treatment where, say, they only get the active drug for, say, a year or 2 years, but there might be a follow-up process for 5 years or 10 years. It really depends on what the trial is. So it might help actually to back up and think of the different phases of trials.
Please.
So there's phase 1, 2, 3, and 4. Phase 1 clinical trials are still trying to figure out how to administer the drug. So is it going to be oral? Is it going to be an intravenous delivery? And also trying to figure out the dosage of the drug. So at this point, you're really dealing with maybe 30 to 50 patients. Phase 2 trials, you're shifting towards more of a focus on safety and efficacy, and you're now incorporating maybe 100 people. With phase 3 trials, now you're increasing the amount of people, still focusing on safety and efficacy, but you're preparing for FDA submission of that investigational drug. So now you're dealing with hundreds of people and looking at the short-term effects of the drug. By the time that you move to phase 4, then now you're dealing with thousands of potential enrollees onto your trial. And that is looking at long-term follow-up. So that's when you're dealing with trials that can have, say, that 10-year follow-up.
Okay. Yeah.
And just to nerd out a little bit,
Yeah,
and
please.
piggyback there, Dr. Lalitsasivimol, you made a lot of mention to specific numbers on different phases of trials. So a trial isn't open for a specific period of time. A trial is instead what we call powered to detect a benefit of a therapy or process for screening or disease progression assessments. So when we come down to, is drug A better than drug B? We can identify what we expect the improvement in a patient to be from phase 1, from phase 2, and then say, in order to make a determination, we need 5,437 patients on this trial, with 3,000 receiving drug A and 2,000 and some change receiving drug B at a minimum. Now, a trial will stay open for that entire length, but during that time, there's safety checks built in to these trials. They're what are called interim analyses. Are the rates of things like adverse events, something going wrong with a drug you are receiving, is that happening more frequently than expected? If that is happening, a study can reach a terminal endpoint prior to that larger target of number of patients.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So a data and safety monitoring committee will periodically review the data and see whether a specific protocol is hitting patient goals. And the number of people that go on, whether it's meeting its safety goals, whether it's meeting its demographic goals, and honestly, whether the tested treatment is going to be beneficial for the patient. That's what it always comes back to.
How many different clinical trials are you running at any given time?
We currently have 23 clinical trials open. 17 of them are directly involved with cancer, but they really run the gamut from diagnostic to treatment to screening to tissue banking to disease management to health services. So backtracking a little bit, when we think of a traditional clinical trial, you kind of think of, oh, well, it's labs, it's a placebo, it's always experimental. But a clinical study can really be expanded to a number of different types. So you've got your cancer prevention, you've got screening, you've got treatment, you've got supportive care, symptom management, surveillance, health-related quality of life, and cancer care delivery. Clinical research really goes beyond just a typical treatment trial. So we talked a little bit about numbers that are on trials. So while the goal of clinical trials is often to meet a certain number of patients to hit a power for eventual analysis, sometimes trials are stopped early because they will not meet the goal because the accrual rate or the number of people that are enrolling on the trial is just too slow, or the study has already found that it is already effective enough based on the current enrollment that you can actually stop the trial. So that actually happens in one of the trials that we had open here. We had an advanced melanoma clinical trial for stage 3 and 4 melanoma patients that had a mutation called BRAF V600 that is unresectable or cannot be removed by surgery. And the question was, is it more beneficial to first deliver immunotherapy or using the body's own immune system to attack the cancer, or is it more beneficial to use a targeted therapy first, targeting that BRAF V600 gene? This trial found that the sequence starting with the immunotherapy actually resulted in a 20% absolute improvement in the 2-year overall survival. So they were able to stop the trial early. It showed this benefit of first-line immunotherapy over the targeted therapy, which is very important for how we treat advanced melanoma in the future. Cancer treatment is guided by National Comprehensive Cancer Network guidelines that are updated periodically, typically every year. And so the results from this study will likely make it into the next iteration of those guidelines. So it's changing. So a study that our patients participated in is actually going to add towards the data that's going to change national guidelines for cancer treatment.
And Diana, if once those guidelines get changed, correct me if I'm wrong, anyone coming in to Kingman would have that option as a therapy without the need of going on a trial now.
Once the NCCN guidelines go into effect.
So instead of only 2,000 individuals being offered this therapy over the course of, say, a 5-year period, it's now available for anyone with that illness.
It will be, yes.
When you have patients on a given clinical trial, you are collecting a lot of data. Help me to understand, and you've touched on this a little bit, but help me to understand where this data goes and how it all gets kind of collated and people make sense of it.
So over the course of a clinical trial, a lot of information is collected from patients, and a lot of it comes from their medical record. It's all information that we would normally collect anyway. It forms the case report form for every cycle that a patient is on. It gets entered into a clinical trial management software that the sponsor uses to monitor our patient's progress on the trial. And it is a secondary check on their part, on us, to make sure that we are following the protocol and we are following guidelines. To more specifically answer your question, information might be shared with the pharmaceutical collaborators who supply the study agents, the institutional review board, which, as Anthony mentioned earlier, is a group of people who review the research with the goal of protecting the people who take part in the study, the FDA and the groups it works with to review the research, the National Cancer Institute and the groups it works with to review research, the National Cancer Institute's National Clinical Trial Network and the groups it works with to conduct research, and the Nevada Cancer Research Foundation National Cancer Institute Community Oncology Research Program, which is our collaborator to bring clinical studies to patients in their own communities.
You said that when a patient is first diagnosed with cancer, you meet with that patient here at the
Correct.
hospital. If I were said patient and I said, well, for example, you say, well, you may qualify for this particular trial. And I say, gee, I don't know. What are some of the pros and cons? What would you say?
I would say that the biggest benefit is that you are now going to be participating in a clinical trial where you have the opportunity to try the newest and most advanced treatments in medical science. They're not yet available to the public. One of the things that I hear the most is that patients are very altruistic. They want to help people, and they want to help people in the future, even if it doesn't necessarily benefit them directly. And we also make sure to discuss with them the potential side effects of the drugs. This will be gone over with them by the physician, by myself, and by the nurse that does the teach, or the process where they get a tour of the cancer center, they understand where they have their follow-up visit, where the restroom is, where our little snack bar is, and where they'll be getting their immunotherapy or their chemotherapy. And basically, it's a walkthrough, so they understand the full process. And the teach doesn't only happen with patients that are on clinical trials, it's with any patient that does get any sort of treatment at the cancer center.
Typically, when I think about clinical trials, I assume that means testing new drugs, but there are a lot of different ways to conduct trials and measure different concepts at work, right?
Absolutely. And when we think about the different domains that a clinical trial can consist of, those treatment trials are core to clinical trials. But there's also screening trials, identifying how common specific cancer types might be within a community and whether or not those are elevated or reduced from the surrounding locations, as well as there are, say, banking trials, which will act to store tissue sections of a tumor so that way when scientists in lab develop new probes to test for unique genes or gene transcripts, we have that stock available to quickly develop new therapies which may have been undetected in the past.
So we currently have a study called the Cancer Moonshot Biobank research study. So if patients do have cancer, they can donate samples from their medical procedures, and then these samples can be blood or tissue and potentially other sample types. It depends on what their cancer is. And with the goal of understanding why some cancers respond to certain cancer treatments and others don't, learning about how cancer changes over time, and then finding better ways to treat cancer in the future. Another study that patients can very easily join right now is called the use of a clinical trial screening tool to address cancer health disparities in the NCI Community Oncology Research Program. So this is essentially geared towards collecting information and understanding why patients do or do not go on clinical trials, whether it is due to a specific demographic, like say, for example, they have difficulty getting to the cancer center, or they don't understand what the purpose of it is, or whether it's from the clinical side, whether they don't meet a specific biomarker testing or they don't meet a specific eligibility criteria.
You do have to solicit calls for that sort of thing, right? Because part of your job is outreach and make sure that people know you exist.
Yes.
Right? How do people reach you?
If you are interested in joining a clinical trial, you can contact me at area code 928-692-4665, or you can go on to the AZKRMC website. The page is called Cancer Clinical Trials, and check out more information there. It also has a list of all of the current clinical trials that we have going on for cancer care. If you're interested in general and what kind of research is going on at the hospital, you can check out our Twitter page. It is twitter.com/KRMC Research.
Good. And please give that contact number one more time.
Area code 928-692-4665.
You two are just like buried in statistics and numbers all the time, right? So you're collecting all this data. Is that fair to say? I don't know.
It's fair to say.
For me, anyway.
We're like dragons with hordes of information.
Okay, so you've been hoarding. So that's very nice. What do you do with it? How do you make it work? How do you see the fruits of that labor?
So one of the things, it depends on what scale you're looking at. So we can talk about the scale of just the Kingman area as a whole. Often drugs are created where they will have a similar indication, or they'll be used to treat a similar illness, often in the same setting, often as a competitor, but they'll have to be researched against one another. So if we look at a couple of different drugs and we find what's called non-inferiority, which is clinical trials speak for neither drug is worse than the other, they both work, but one drug offered at your local hospital costs $70,000 a dose, and the other drug offered at your local hospital costs $100 a dose.
Sorry to interrupt, but you can have that great a disparity?
Absolutely. Yeah. That information can be used to change or to inform the physicians at your hospital and make available often those cheaper drugs for the same benefit in the long road. A more expensive drug does not equal a better drug.
That is Diana Lalitsasivimol, PhD. She is the manager of the Office of Clinical Research and Sponsored Programs and also the co-chair of the Institutional Review Board at KRMC. Dr. Lalitsasivimol, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
And Anthony Santarelli, PhD. He is the director of the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs. Dr. Santarelli, thank you.
Always a pleasure.
And that is the program. That's Focus on Your Health. I'm TG Lafredo. Thank you so much for listening. We'll catch you next time.